We've talked about pre-registration before, and it's come to mind again because this is an evolving topic. A lot of people continue to publish pros and cons about it. There seems to be more of a trend towards doing it. I do know that some journals highly encourage it. And although the papers I'm going to discuss today aren't from neuroimaging per se, it's in consumer psychology, it's still the same concepts. And I found the dialect between one group that was coming down very strongly in favor of pre-registration and the other group who was a little bit more skeptical and critical to be illuminating of the process as a whole. So again, nothing to do with fMRI or neuroimaging or even necessarily psychology, but just the concepts behind pre-registration and how that can help science more generally. So to begin, and this is a slide I show in all of my intro classes when we start talking about fMRI analysis, when we get to region of interest analyses, this is an important topic to discuss because I point out, well, what if you beforehand selected some region of interest, shown by this red circle right here, and then when you run your group level analyses, you get your whole brain results. Here is where the overlap of statistically significant voxels, let's say, P less than 0.01 or zero point zero 0.05 voxels, where they appear on a whole brain map. And so you can see that this ROI captures some of them, but maybe there are some other voxels that are not significant or maybe in the opposite direction. And if you average across all the voxels in this ROI, you get a non-significant result. So you see this, and you're maybe really close to the edge, maybe P equals 0.06 or 0.07, and you just know, you can feel it in your bones that this is a significant result. You just know it. So you go back to the drawing board, you find some other literature that suggests another ROI, and you say, well, yeah, let's use this one, which is also kind of in the neighborhood. It's also supported by another study observing the same phenomenon. And lo and behold, this one is closer to the bullseye of where the center of mass of this significant cluster is. And this ROI analysis is, in fact, significant. And so this brings up the topic of intention, about what the person was thinking when they selected the ROI in the first place. Now, for most papers that we read, we don't really know all of the steps that led to what we see in the figure in the paper. You have this very polished, very trimmed and barbered result that looks really good, and more often than not supports the hypothesis that the paper was leading with. And we accept that in good faith, the person wanted to use that particular ROI in the first place. So we can use ROI as a surrogate for really any kind of test. And this goes back, this is a 1988 paper, which talks about the so-called researcher degrees of freedom. And this, I think, deserves an award just for the title alone. This is by Feinstein, and it's Scientific Standards and Epidemiologic Studies of the Menace of Daily Life. And anybody who sees these pop up, they're ubiquitous, they're in newspapers, they're online. And you seem to see every day a new epidemiological study that has maybe thousands of subjects and maybe hundreds of variables that they collected, demographics, diet, exercise, a number of hours spent watching TV, so on and so forth. And then you get these sometimes, on the face of it, a little bit ridiculous and also some contradictory uh, recommendations about how to live your life. For example, you should walk 30 minutes a day, make sure not to walk too much, but also don't walk too little. And on average, your lifespan will increase by 3 years or something like that. And so these are notorious because they have so many degrees of freedom. There's so many ways you can analyze these data sets. And it's given rise to a phrase called hypothesizing after the fact, or also hypothesizing after results are known. The acronym is HARKing. So we've all seen this, and it can be a big problem because as the years go by, obviously there are more epidemiologic studies. People can analyze the same data set different ways and come to different conclusions. Also, somewhat related, but not really the focus of this talk is a lot of the times, well, sometimes you'll see that these analyses are not corrected for multiple comparisons. So there are many tests that can go on in the background. Sometimes you don't know exactly how many tests that they did. It could be dozens of tests before they settle on one that is in line with maybe a specific hypothesis or maybe just some trend in the health field or the sciences. And so there's a high premium and reward for getting one result as opposed to another. And if you don't correct for multiple comparisons, we know from Stats 101, this is going to inflate the chance of getting a false positive. To drive this point home, this is more recent, well, about 10 years ago, but I remember seeing this in the New York Times. This was, again, this was big news across many mainstream media outlets, in addition to being published in Science. This is by the Open Science Collaboration, of which Brian Nozick is a founding member. So Brian Nozick was and is a social psychologist. Now, he did some work on the IAT, for example, but he also later on has been very invested in seeing whether the effects in psychological science, but also probably in science more generally, are replicable. What you can see here is the original effect size in some of these papers that they agreed to replicate. So they contacted the authors, or they had some access to these data sets, and they had an independent team try to replicate the results that were in the paper. And I think sometimes they could also use an independent data set. I don't know exactly the details, but the idea is, can you get the same effect that was published in a journal before this study came out? So you can see here the original effect size. If we look at all of these hash marks over here, indicating an individual study's effect size, this distribution shows a pretty strongly rightward skewed distribution of effect sizes. Notice 0 is over here. And so you're going to be having effect sizes on average about, let's say 0.3 roughly, somewhere around there. That's a pretty healthy effect size. Cohen's d. And also with the p-values, you also see many more significant p-values in the original effects than you do in the replication effects. So look at the replication effect sizes, now shaded in pink, and you see more of a normal distribution centered around 0, where roughly half of those effect sizes are positive and roughly half are negative. Again, this can call into question from these graphs alone how much of these effects, these original effects, are reliable. We all know about things like the file drawer problem. We know about publication bias, in which usually statistically significant effects are the ones that are published, right? For a long time, that's been a convention. That's what you need. That's your meal ticket to get into one of these prestigious journals. If you don't have any significant effects, they're not going to publish it, usually. There's a growing trend that's starting to go away from that, but that's how it's usually been presented. And there are good reasons for that. We want to know where and when there are significant effects, right? Those tend to be of interest. Those tend to sometimes influence changes in policy. So again, we're very tuned in to this convention of p less than 0.05 and having a significant effect. But these results from Open Science should call that into question. So again, this is another perspective of those original effect sizes versus the replication effect sizes. So this distribution, very curiously, they seem to be all right above 0. Very few, if none at all, are below 0. Whereas the replications is a little bit more normally distributed around 0. And also, more tellingly, if we look at just the p-values, and this is looking at more like the binary yes or no, are you going to get that significant effect? And usually that leads to, it's going to be published or not. You can see that there's a huge pileup right around this 0.05 level for the original studies. So it's not conclusive proof, it's circumstantial, but it's highly suggestive that what's going on is another related phenomenon. In addition to HARKing, we could also have something called p-hacking, in which you keep doing different tests or you keep doing different permutations of parameters until you can get p less than 0.05. For the replications, again, this distribution of p-values seems a little bit more reasonable if we are expecting more or less what we would expect if we just ran a bunch of studies. And would we see significant effects all the time? No. That's not as though we would never see significant effects, but there's probably some balance between significant and non-significant effects. So that brings me to the theme of the current paper, which again is about pre-registration. And it's worth defining clearly what reproducibility and replication are, just to these fine-grained distinctions between the two. So replication is arriving at the same result using an independent data set. Reproducibility is the ability to obtain the same result using the same data and methods. So we've heard in various terms this whole issue referred to as either the replication crisis or the reproducibility crisis. So those two terms aren't exactly the same thing. They're very closely related, and they all tap into whether the same effect can be obtained by two independent groups, whether they're using the same data set or an independent data set. So if we go with the assumption that being able to reproduce somebody's results, replicate them is a good thing, that it's good for science, that it can establish the robustness of a given effect and make sure we're not just looking at a false positive or something spurious or noise, we move to this new trend called pre-registration, which has been around, from what I can tell, it's really started to take off since about 2015. So this is a figure from the Simmons paper, which was published a few years ago in 2021. And this group, in that first paper, that link that I sent out, they were the group that actually created this website aspredicted.org, which makes it very accessible and very easy to create your own pre-registration. We'll talk about the details of pre-registration in just a second. But what I want to show here is that the popularity of pre-registration has been increasing quite dramatically over the past, well, as of that publication, the past 5 or 6 year time window. You can see it goes from near zero to about close to 2,000 each month. And I have reason to believe that it's continued around that trend in most recent years as well. And this is just through As Predicted. It's not the only portal through which to do pre-registrations. You can also do it through Open Science Framework, for example. Now, like I said, these papers are focused more on consumer psychology, but they also give some side-by-side comparisons with psychology journals more generally. So you can see that there are a high percentage of articles these days that contain a pre-registered study, and some journals are actually encouraging people to pre-register before they submit. The idea behind pre-registration is that you specify exactly what your hypothesis is, what tests you're going to run, what ROIs you're going to use, exactly what basically your method section is going to be before you run the study. And then that gets either approved or rejected by the reviewing board. And then they say, we're going to accept whatever you publish, regardless of whether it's going to be a significant result or not. So there does seem to be a trend towards it. It's becoming more widespread. And like I said, the pre-registration idea is to hold researchers to account, both to themselves and to the reviewers and to the readers, but mostly to themselves. I mean, this really allows you to take some of the stress off having to find a significant result, or else the data set is essentially worthless. And that's been the fate of many data sets which do not contain a statistically significant effect. This gives a lot more transparency about the methods of the paper, in particular, specifying exactly what is confirmatory and what's going to be exploratory. So again, just to distinguish between these terms, confirmatory means that you have some hypothesized tests or hypothesized brain regions, in the case of fMRI, ahead of time, based on theory, based on other papers that you want to investigate. You want to confirm a specific hypothesis. Exploratory is, you can think of that as like whole brain analyses. You're analyzing every single voxel in the brain. and you don't necessarily have any real constraints on it. You could use any kind of contrast you want, really. And those can also be valuable, right? Because you can get some unexpected findings that can lead to future confirmatory analyses. And we know from the history of science that many of the most interesting and most important advances have been through exploratory research, but both are necessary. Pre registration just holds people to account for the confirmatory part of it. It's worth pointing out this does not mean that you can never do exploratory analyses, right? But you need to label them as such. And the ones that are confirmatory, you need to do as you specified in the paper. Theoretically, this should lead to a better chance at successful reproduction and replication of results. People have a better idea exactly what you were intending going into with the data set, and they can better track your progress. And lastly, as I mentioned, because with pre-registration, the editorial board will either accept or reject at that stage before you even run a single analysis, this should reduce the incentive for p-hacking. Because whether or not you get a significant result, they will still accept it as long as the methods are sound, as long as the study and the design is appropriately motivated. So I want to show one more paper here from Catherine Button. So it's a really important paper just about the overall prevalence of inflated results and probably inflated false positives. And this looked at the overall statistical power of a study. In other words, what is the probability that it could detect an effect if it was actually there? And power is directly related to your sample size. So N here's the number of studies, not the sample size, but the number of studies. And here is our different bins for the percentage power. So you can see that when we talk about what is the adequate power, most people in grants, the norm, the convention is at least 80% power. But you can see if we look at the power of a lot of these studies that have been run and submitted, it falls well below that. The majority of them are below that, which really calls into question whether the results can be trusted. Because we know if you have a very underpowered study, a very small sample size study, the only results that you could ever possibly see have to pass an absurdly high statistical threshold. They have to have huge effect sizes. And the probability that we're just seeing these gigantic effect sizes time and again, and those are the only ones getting published, is it should be suspiciously small, that probability. So sample size is an issue, but pre-registration may be able to help protect against these inflated effect sizes and significant results that we're seeing. So with pre-registration, we posit hypotheses before collecting the data. We specify parameters such as sample size, exactly what kind of analysis we're going to do, what are all the dependent variables, and often overlooked, how exactly are we going to exclude outliers? So ways that we can do this, for this one example, there's the Open Science Framework. Okay, this is one website. This has been around for quite a while. And this allows you to pre-register your study. This allows you to timestamp it. And then this allows you to have a clear record of the choices that were made to reduce the biases of the data that are in front of you. So this is a very good option. OSF, this is part of that Open Science Foundation, the one that published that study back in 2015. And again, this is an option available to everybody. Another alternative is aspredicted.org. So this is one that has been created by the authors of one of these papers we're going to discuss. Again, makes it very simple to just list everything you're going to do. You list all of the authors on this project. And then this will produce a timestamp document that you can submit along with your results to a journal, and then they can look at this and decide whether or not to reject it based on the merits of your study design and hypotheses. Okay, it's not exhaustive, but those are two major avenues that you can do. So, for example, the concerns with pre-registration that want to be addressed by this Simonson et al. Paper is to uh, talk about a few things that might come to mind when people are maybe a little hesitant or cagey about doing pre-registration. And the first one that always comes up is pre-registration prevents exploration, like those exploratory analyses that we were talking about before. So, for example, consider a researcher who believes that their manipulation will affect one dependent variable, but doesn't know whether it's going to affect a second dependent variable. So, if they don't pre register, they might be hesitant to run the entire set of analyses that they see might be justified by the data they collect. Maybe they see some things after data collection they didn't think about before. But pre-registration doesn't necessarily exclude that. It just says, here's some confirmatory analyses. If there's anything that comes up afterwards, and there's a lot of latitude here, people can just come up with some other idea, or they see something in the data after they've worked with it for a long time. You still receive full credit for it. It's not as though it doesn't go in the publication, but it will be just listed as an exploratory analysis, not a confirmatory one. The second one is that pre-registration is too onerous, which for somebody who's completely new to it, it can seem maybe a little intimidating, maybe the amount of time, or you're not that familiar with open science framework or as predicted, and you decide, I don't really want to waste my time on that. Why fix it if it's not broken? I've been doing it my way for years or decades. I'm not going to change. That's all well and good. They've tried to make these websites as streamlined and as accessible as possible. And I think that if there are, walkthrough videos online that clearly show how you can do this, they should also make it a lot more accessible as well. And really, if you look at it overall, it doesn't change the overall amount of time that goes into the experiment, or it shouldn't. Instead of the usual pipeline of you think of design, then you collect data, then you think of the analysis. With pre-registration, you think of the design and the analysis first, and then you collect data. So you're still doing all the steps, just now you're front loading at the beginning with the design and the analysis. So this might actually make things a little bit clearer, because now you have some very clearly defined goals, some check boxes, and then you can attack each of those in turn, and it should be a lot simpler. 3, pre-registration is bad for the scientific culture. So this argument, I never really even thought about it. Doesn't seem like a very strong objection, but the way that they framed it is that the fact that somebody pre-registers, that a lot of people might be pre-registering, implies some kind of bad faith or a culture of mistrust. I don't really see how that happens or what the connection is, but they're just bringing this up as a possible objection and saying, well, this doesn't really lead to any kind of bad effects to the scientific culture. In fact, it should lead to greater trust and greater reliability, and cleaning up some of the doubts surrounding this replication crisis that we're going through. And the last possible objection is that pre-registration simply does not help. Which, again, I don't find a particularly strong objection, but their response is that it should help quite a bit, again, by just making the results more robust, more trustworthy. And they point out that clinical drug trials, for example, they also go through peer review, just like our studies do, and yet they're required by law to be pre-registered, because it's really important that the results from these clinical trials are true. I don't see why we should hold ourselves to a different standard. It's not as though, most of the time our research isn't life or death. It's not as though we're testing out, cancer drugs, for example, or testing, the safety of food preservatives. But the integrity of our science does matter. It could lead to either a solid foundation or a shoddy foundation for later research that does make a real effect in people's lives. And so pre-registration should help us solidify some of the foundations of our science. So that's the kind of the meat of the paper, how they raised these objections, then answered them as I summarized. And they also give a checklist, and this should apply not just to consumer psychology, but really to any kind of scientific field, of examples of good versus bad answers to pre-registration questions. So, for example, they talk about things like if you specify your research question, you don't need to be, uh, too florid. You don't need to be too verbose about it. Just state the question or the hypothesis of interest. Be short, concise, to the point. Make it easy to understand, and most importantly, don't give yourself too much wiggle room, and also the reviewer and reader too much wiggle room to think about new analyses. Really try to make the confirmatory side of it adhere as closely as possible to a very clearly defined series of steps. Right. So the goal is really not to tie researchers' hands, as Nelson et al. Have said, but to uncover the reader's eyes as to what is actually going on with the experiment. They also have checklists for the researchers and reviewers, right? So if you're reviewing any of these pre-registered studies, and I should say that I haven't come across a pre-registered study as a reviewer yet, but again, these are some useful heuristics, some useful checkboxes to go through. And simply to ask yourself, did they follow exactly what they said they were going to do? Were they thorough and were they detailed in explaining the experimental conditions and contrasts that they were going to do, and so on? And also, is the pre-registration complete and unambiguous? Is there any wiggle room or any outs that they could find? So I think that those are pretty useful to have in your back pocket if you ever want to go back into it. They also talk about the problems that pre-registration cannot solve. Right, so it's not a panacea. Obviously, there are always going to be some things that are going to slip through the cracks. One is unreported studies. So there's still going to be a file drawer problem. People who really want their work cited and to get the most press are the ones who are going to be reporting significant results most of the time. Unless there's, a compelling non-significant result that might suggest that a theory could be debunked or might be evidence in the other direction that could basically be in contrast or contrary to an established finding. We're not really talking about those necessarily, but people may keep running studies, especially if it's kind of a low cost endeavor. A lot of behavioral studies, for example, you could theoretically keep running those until you get a significant result. And now we're kind of one step removed from the problem, and there's no real way for pre-registration to force these unreported studies into the light where we can see them. The only thing I would say about this is that for these unreported studies, it could reduce the number of them by incentivizing researchers to pre-register and essentially saying it doesn't really matter if your result is not significant, we'll still publish it anyway. So maybe some people will be less circumspect and less cautious about submitting or running one of these higher risk studies and then submitting them for publication if they know that it still might get published, even if the results are not statistically significant. Another potential problem that it cannot solve is hidden confounds. Right. So this is something that's kind of inherent to the experimental endeavor. It's not something we can always account for. Sometimes we collect all of our data, then we find that there was a confound we did not anticipate, and we're really kind of stuck at that point. And the person may, in good faith, continue with their analyses, and it's only after everything's been published that it's detected by the readers that there's some hidden confounds in that. Well, one way to address this, pre-registration is not going to always find this. This is really on the researcher to find that. They can be addressed by the public sharing of research materials, right? So if somebody does find a hidden confound in a paper that's already been published, they can point this out. It's not as though they're trying to pull a fast one, we would expect. But people can go to the original data, the original methods, and maybe try to address it, or maybe run their own study to try to address these confounds. And that could be a way of resolving that issue. There may be observational research that's already been collected. There's observational research that is really exploratory in its essence. You collect a bunch of data and then you kind of sort through it afterwards. And these can also be useful studies, right? These could be mass surveys, these could be observational research studies that are with populations that are rare. It might be a certain kind of environment where it's very difficult to know ahead of time exactly how you're going to control for it. Maybe you can't even control for everything. And it's not something necessarily that lends itself to pre-registration, and that's okay. Observational studies are still useful. We're not saying that they should not be published. We're not saying that only studies that are pre-registered are trustworthy. It's not necessarily something that we can pre-register. And the last one is just outright fraud. People making up results, for example. And there's some well-known examples of this. There was Mark Hauser with the primate studies. There was Diederik Stapel with the social psychology studies. Really, at that point, pre-registration cannot necessarily detect that, right? If somebody simply makes something up or inserts some kind of spurious results, how can we exactly know whether that was true or not? So the idea is, well, we can't necessarily detect every possible case of fraud, but the analogy they make is that it's like drug testing for professional athletes, right? So athletes do not need to know that their blood will be tested every day for steroids. I'm quoting from the paper. They only need to know that on any given day, their blood might be tested. So just like athletes accept that they need to be checked sometimes, so too should researchers. And I think this gets more into the actual sharing of data. This isn't necessarily pre-registration, but it gets more towards the sharing aspect of open science. That makes fraud much harder to perpetrate if, in fact, you have provided all the materials. Not like everybody needs to be a digital forensics expert, but if somebody really has committed fraud, it probably would be easier to detect if you go through things like the header information of the Nifty files, for example, where you look at how certain Excel spreadsheets were timestamped. Okay, so having gone through that paper, we now look at a response to it, a little bit more skeptical approach by Pham and O. Also in that same journal. This is again Consumer Psychology. This is in 2021. And they laud the aspects of pre-registration that are good, right? They say that there's a lot to be said for it. They're not saying don't do it, but they are saying that it is by no means a silver bullet. It does not address all of the problems, and that in some cases it may lead to some adverse effects on the field. The first one they brought up, I think this is their weakest argument, is implementation challenges. So it's about the amount of time it takes researchers to pre-register and also for building and maintaining a pre-registration infrastructure. I would argue the pre-registration infrastructure is already there. And as we can see, it really should not take that much time to pre-register a report. If you look at the entire amount of time that is sunk into an experiment, it should be roughly the same whether or not you pre-register. So this particular objection, I didn't find too convincing. The other ones I did find, a little bit more food for thought. So one is the illusion of transparency, which I thought was funny. They call it HARKing, or pre-registering after results are known. So in their view, they say, well, pre-registration and the whole open science trend is becoming socially desirable. It's a mark of status to say that you pre-register a study and that you're on board the open science train. And what they say is, well, it's very trivial. It's almost, it's very, very easy for a researcher who's pretty cynical to really run all the results ahead of time. They've already collected the data and then submit a pre-registration report. It's not going to be possible for somebody to go to that person's institution and know exactly when they collected the data, right? So you can see how this could be easily gamed. And that could lead to, an illusion that, we're really holding people to account. They're, making these very rigorous pre-registration frameworks and reports before they collect a single scan of data. But, really for people who are committed to subverting that process, it's very easy to do. There's also the illusion of robustness. And they quote the literal definition of robust, which means capable of performing without failure under a wide range of conditions. That's the dictionary definition of robust. And what they say is the true mark of a robust finding is not mere replicability under specified conditions, but rather the ability to reproduce it across a reasonable range of conditions. So what they're saying here is that the pre-registration gives you the illusion of robustness because it does seem like it's a very rigorous approach, and it is in many senses. But it is holding the analysis to a very circumscribed set of parameters. So it's a double-edged sword because if you think about looking at it from a more exploratory perspective, if you're testing the same result across, let's say including many different kinds of dependent variables, many different combinations, and it still holds up, then that would be more evidence that it is robust. We've seen Tyler Coney. We talked about one of his papers a few years ago, talking about this same issue. Now, I would say that the obvious rejoinder is that, well, there's no prohibition against exploratory, so why don't you simply do that? And then that can be part of the overall robustness of the finding. But point noted. So they bring up, again, one of the objections raised in that previous paper we discussed, which is, there might be under exploration, loss of flexibility, higher type 2 error, which is not negligible. We're really habituated to defending ourselves against type 1 errors, any kind of false positives. Whereas type 2 errors or false negatives, not detecting an effect that's actually there, seem to go under the radar with our current techniques, and especially with the p-value approach. So one of the major drawbacks, this loss of flexibility, if we think about pre-registration as putting a premium on adhering to the confirmatory analyses, and that's really all the people are going to focus on, then there is less of an incentive to do any other kind of exploratory analyses if you know it's going to be published anyway, is their argument. There may be undesirable changes in the types of research conducted, right? So in this case, it may be that people now go towards more the safer options. Okay, they go towards very incremental studies, ones that are not very risky, ones that they know will probably yield a significant effect, ones that do not take a massive investment of resources if they know that it's going to be published regardless. And I'm quoting from the paper, paradoxically, the incentive to pursue only studies with a strong likelihood of confirming the researcher's a priori expectations encourages research with a lesser diagnostic value from a Bayesian perspective, in that such studies are implicitly designed to produce results that are unlikely to cause a revision of prior beliefs. Another issue that they raise is the possible politicization of the research enterprise. So this may be There could be possibly a scenario in which there is a pre-registration request, maybe from reviewers who find that there's a result that challenges an established finding or an established way of doing things, established way of thinking. And there may be a higher bar or a harsher treatment of those studies that are not pre-registered that challenge certain embedded beliefs in the scientific field. Now, I haven't seen this play out in practice. Again, I do think it's an interesting point to raise. I haven't really seen an issue in which, let's say an unpre-registered study was submitted and then the editor simply disregarded it because it was an inconvenient finding from that editor's perspective. And they could easily say, well, it's not pre-registered, so I'm going to remove it. So again, I haven't heard any cases. Maybe this has happened. I didn't see any citations of it, but it is worth keeping in mind. Pre-registration might just be another gatekeeping mechanism to try to keep out certain types of research or try to suppress certain types of research. And lastly, this is related to point number 2. There could be a greater amount of reproducible but pointless science. So, this may be, again, these really safe studies. You're putting more incentive on these very, very small steps. We're not encouraging really risky, but potentially high yield studies, which could also be a potential issue. And lastly, what they point out is that is pre-registration necessary for good science? And first of all, they talk about let's keep the replicability crisis in perspective. Yes, there are a lot of findings that are not replicated, but in that open science project, about 40% of them were replicated. So it's not as though every single paper is suspect. And we really should be looking at things like, has the data been shared? What was the power like? What was the sample size? These are also very important things to keep in mind. And we risk possibly being in tunnel vision for just pre-registration as the mark of a good study. It can be a hallmark of a good study, but it should not be the only one that we look for. As I mentioned before, exploration and serendipity is part of scientific progress. We have some very well-known examples of people simply stumbling upon something they didn't expect, going in with a certain hypothesis, was just kind of found by the way. And those are also important to keep in mind. In that same vein, there are other paths for reproducibility. Namely, they really point out that the sharing of the materials, the raw data, the methods that they use, the scripts, is going to be very important for reproducibility and to give a more accurate picture of the robustness of the findings. So this figure from their paper was a hypothetical 2x2 matrix where they have the truth value of the finding. Is the finding true or false? Also, the finding interesting, useful? Is it not interesting or useful? Pre-registration focuses on removing everything in this truth value false. In other words, cells B and D. And what the authors, what Pham and O want to focus on is whether the finding is interesting and useful, right? So they think what might happen is an inflated amount of findings that are not interesting and useful, even though they might be true. So pre-registration could possibly lead to that. Again, I take their points. I do think it's important to have skepticism, especially if there's a trend that has a lot of social prestige or a lot of social pressure behind it. I do think it's worth taking a step back and looking at some of these objections. That being said, I would need to wait to see whether we do find a lot of these issues where all of a sudden we're seeing this massive glut of studies that are pre-registered but showing non-significant results or really trivial kind of useless results, really just playing it safe, and also whether it's being used as a gatekeeping mechanism to maybe unfairly target certain kinds of research and overly promote other kinds of research. So their recommendations, will end on this note, is to not just focus on pre-registration. Again, look at other aspects. Are they sharing the data? Are their sample sizes appropriate? And so on. And this goes into evaluating the overall quality, not just transparency. You could imagine that transparency becomes almost like a new p-value. Okay, was it pre-registered? Yes or no? If it is, accept it. If not, reject it. Again, there's no substitute for really analyzing the substance of the experiment. And I think that if pre-registration does work the way it's supposed to, that should happen as part of the process, right? The reviewers look at the methods, they look at the design and the hypotheses ahead of time and make an educated judgment about whether to accept it or not. Regardless, and I do agree with this, they say that we should shift the emphasis away from significance testing, right? And there's been, again, another running battle of opinion on using p-values versus using something like Bayesian inference or a range of plausible effect sizes that might be useful and true. And going away from this binary, yes or no, is it significant, is it not? And I do think that some work by Paul Taylor and colleagues at NIH, and also Elena Allen's article in Neuron, this is back in 2012, I believe, give or take, about highlighting the entire range of whole brain results and not just hiding anything that does not pass a significance threshold, is an important step in that direction for fMRI analysis. And lastly, we should keep in mind the entire pattern of empirical and conceptual evidence. One quote that came to mind, this was from a rather old book I remember reading a while ago on, it was basically how to write a research paper. Okay, and it seems kind of musty, this is before, computers were widespread and so on and so forth. But one thing that really stuck with me is, in science, just as with let's say a trial by grand jury, each new particle of evidence that trends in one direction, the effect is multiplicative as opposed to additive, right? So you can say if there's two witnesses that saw an event as opposed to one, that has a kind of super additive effect as to the validity of whether something was seen to have happened or not. The same thing if we find a certain trend or certain pattern of overall, well-designed studies pointing in one direction, we can use that as making more airtight case that this effect exists instead of just looking at them in isolation. So those were the two papers. Again, this is a debate that's ongoing. Now, pre-registration is something that I do intend to do on my next empirical paper. We'll see when that comes out. But I do think that this is an important trend. I think it's important to keep new graduate students and even people who've been in the field aware of, how this is going. How easy is it to do? What are some good examples to start out with? And I also want to point out that Stefan Bullman, one of the developers, the lead developer actually of NeuroDesk, which is a container, a suite of neuroimaging programs, he's given demonstrations about how to use Jupyter notebooks within NeuroDesk to register a kind of a sample study, a dummy study, right? Like something you can download some data from OpenNeuro and then analyze it, but also submit a registration report to Open Science Framework. So I think that there are some very strong attempts being made at making this more accessible, and I'm curious to see how this pans out in the next 5 to 10 years.